Thank you all for being here. Wow, this is a much larger audience than expected, which I guess tells us a little bit about how much interest there is in this topic. Thank you all for finding your way through Thursday afternoon traffic and being here with us. Thank you to Prashant and Ashish from the BIC program team for really having conceptualized this with us and inviting me to moderate. So I'm here today less in my professional role and more in role as a parent of a 13-year-old. In role as a parent of a 13-year-old, I feel like my daughter and myself are sort of bobbing in the ocean, being pulled by various currents that are extremely present and extremely strong, but unknown to us or invisible to us and hard to predict. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from this panel so that I can find a little bit of understanding and possibly some anchoring so we don't feel so tethered. So just untethered, rather. So just very quickly, show of hands, how many of you, like me, are parents of adolescents? Okay. Quite a few. Okay. And how many of you, this is my curiosity, how many of you feel like you've figured it out? Okay. Excellent. All right. Good. Then we're all sort of in the same boat. Just to frame the conversation a little bit, it's inspired by the television series Adolescence, but we're not sticking to it very closely. Again, just out of curiosity, how many of you here have seen this television show? Wow. Quite a few of us. So I won't go into a summary. Suffice to say, this talk is going to be on adolescence as a developmental phase. Upon that, layered onto that, social media and algorithms and the types of pressures that puts on young people and the types of impact that can have. And eventually, of course, is there something we can do about it? We as parents, as school communities, and of course the community at large, because really, frankly, this is all of our collective responsibility. Yeah? So without further ado, I invite you to put questions down. We'll come to questions at the end. We're planning to have a conversation for about a little under an hour, so that to leave about a whole half hour for questions at the end. I'd like to invite, maybe first, Sansita, to answer the question of Adolescence, this TV show. It was set in the UK, very particular cultural dynamics there. How relevant do you think it is to India? Does this stuff happen here?
Okay. Hello? Okay, thank you so much, Maitri. Yeah, I'd like to start off by saying it's incredibly relevant to the Indian urban reality because Jamie's world, while geographically distant, I think the psychological architecture is very similar to India's. So, you've got adolescents that are chronically online but emotionally offline. And you've got this immersion in regressive digital subcultures that are often masked as empowerment. And you have this sort of peer-led moral confusion. So I've seen how this would unfold in my own social circles. So it's not necessarily in the red pill kind of terminology. That's more of a westernized, Reddit-coded form. But I think it casually seeps into sexist reels or YouTubers and influencers that propagate this misguided notion that masculinity equals misogyny. And they're glorifying aggression and dominance while ridiculing vulnerability. And they're framing women as the problem. So I think in India, this concept of the manosphere, it doesn't just come through figures like Andrew Tate, but also through a lot of localized and regional influencers that are starting to prop up. And they're kind of cloaking all of their misogynistic remarks in humor. So what ends up happening is it's shared widely among adolescents. And that's how more people of this particular age group get exposed to it, and their whole value system gets changed. And so I think one thing that I can talk about in the Indian context is how boys in India grew up with very little or a severe lack of a space for healthy emotional expression. So conversations around sex and gender and masculinity, femininity, identity, these are all still looked at as topics of taboo. So what ends up happening is these online male influencers, they give them an illusion of strength, through control and anger and kind of an anti-feminist rhetoric. They're obviously already going through this very tumultuous experience of just being a teenager. And they're confused and they're in pain, and all of these feelings and emotions aren't addressed. And they're not validated very well. So the manosphere and these kind of influencers and figures give them a quick fix. It's the space where they feel like they're always right, always in control, and always in power. And in fact, so a 2023 study found that boys that were drawn to the manosphere were often experiencing feelings of insecurity and loneliness. So this is like further exacerbated by the narratives of alpha and beta men in this whole manosphere. So I think what we have to realize is that these radicalized boys, it's not stemming from a hatred of women. It kind of stems from confusion and loneliness and a desperate search for answers. So,
Thank you so much for that. And I'm just, it really helps for you to frame it like that. This is not about hatred of girls, but it's some sort of search for your own sense of self, right? Or some sense of power or empowerment. And in that, they find answers coming from what you call the manosphere. How many people here are not familiar with the manosphere as a term? Okay, so maybe worthwhile for us to explain it a bit. I wonder if that's something that you would like to explain, Saurabh.
Just building off what Sansita said, the manosphere is essentially this collection of media personalities, particularly influencers across a range of social media platforms, who platform very misogynistic content that is again rooted in the idea that Sansita just spoke about, which is this idea that the true victims in all of this have been men, right? And it's easy for a lot of people to buy into that because of what she spoke about in terms of feelings of loneliness, in terms of this belief that we've been left out of these social justice struggles that have privileged one group of people over another. And so the manosphere caters to feelings that a lot of people may already have, but what it does is that it provides this entire ecosystem of influences of people who are profiting off those feelings. And that's really where the problem is, because they're taking feelings like loneliness, like isolation, like rejection, particularly in sexual contexts, and they're weaponizing that to sell what they want. And what they want to sell is this idea that all of the progress that we've made has been founded on a lie, and that we need to hark back to traditional ways of living. And so there's also a dangerous interplay when you look at a context like India between hardcore sort of religious fundamentalists, right, and these toxically masculine sort of influences. And they willy-nilly borrow from religion, from what they assume about power dynamics, to create the perfect sort of Frankenstein creation of masculinity and toxic masculinity at that. And so the manosphere is just a place. It's an ecosystem of different influences, often who cross-pollinate and interact with each other and support each other to boost each other's platforms, to create an entire sort of alternative understanding of everything. So if there is one narrative about how women have been oppressed by patriarchal institutions for hundreds of years, there's an alternative narrative to that within the ecosystem that social media platforms provide. And it's an entire, I think the best way to describe the manosphere is an interactive information ecosystem, because that's really what it is. It's like an entire system of knowledge that's been reconstructed by a certain group of people pushing a certain agenda.
Thank you so much for that. And if we want to sort of take, maybe I'll open this to Nina as well, of the same question of how relevant is this, the type of themes that we saw and heard in adolescence, how relevant is that to the Indian context from a school perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Maitri. I'm just looking at the overflowing audience, and I think that in itself answers the question of whether it's relevant or not. And I think it is, absolutely. That's the long and short of it, right? In terms of the dramatization of what we saw, that, I guess, is an extreme version of our fears. And I think why it struck a chord with so many people and why a lot of you are here is because of the sense of dread that you connected with. And it is a parent's worst nightmare. It is a school's worst nightmare. So in terms of relevance, absolutely. With the frequency with which these things are happening, I'm not even locating it longer in just a metro context. This is also rural India. We have the largest adolescent population in the world, 250 million plus, if I'm not mistaken. And about 65% of them have access to media and internet. And in fact, there was an ASER study that looked at even kids who are illiterate teenagers who cannot read a paragraph are able to navigate their way around social media and access YouTube content, right? So this is pan-India. This is pan-India. So the kinds of themes that are showing up in terms of growing up, of loss, of belonging, of parents connecting, of identity, I think these are universal themes, which is why it's resonating all across the planet.
So there's something about the manosphere, and there is something about adolescence as being a time of particular, perhaps, vulnerabilities, right? Psychological, social vulnerabilities. So if we take a couple of steps back and we just perhaps understand adolescence as a developmental phase, maybe we can start at that point. So I'm going to invite Nina to start us off, and then Shekhar to add into that conversation. Tell us about adolescence. What's going on?
Right. So I think the first thing that we have to throw out of the window is that adolescents are little adults. They're not. It's also the age of adolescence. So I think if we kind of understood adolescence as maybe 10 to 17, that is no longer the case. The WHO has, in fact, increased the age for adolescence, so it goes from 10 all the way to 21 plus. So if we're looking at adolescence, we can roughly understand it as happening in 3 phases. You have the early, you have middle, and you have late. And with all the physical changes that happen, those are the ones that are most visible to parents and to educators. But what's also happening are social emotional changes, cognitive changes, and all of this, of course, is happening with changes in terms of neurobiology, right? And maybe I'd just like to spend a little bit of time, because I think what you picked up on was the sense of vulnerability. Now, if the question that is being asked is, why should this matter in this time in our developmental spans? It's also because the window that neurobiology offers us is tremendous. So adolescence is seen as a time of both potential in terms of thriving and flourishing, and also vulnerability. Now, the central task of an adolescent is to establish a sense of self, right? That is a central task. Now, alongside that, what's happening at the brain are very complex and fascinating neural changes, right? So development is occurring from the back and it moves towards the front. So if you can just imagine, and as we were told by our teachers, if you can imagine that you have the accelerator of a car that's being fine-tuned. The brakes, though, are still at bicycle level, right? So that's the kind of development that happens. Now, the back of the brain and the middle are also areas that that engage with reward and belonging. So we are highly motivated to look for things that reward the brain. And what is it that rewards the brain at this point in time? It's the social acceptance, it's the like, which makes them that much more vulnerable. Now, the front or the prefrontal cortex, which actually engages with executive functions, which is your prioritizing, decision making, being able to regulate your sense of emotional control, all of that goes well into your mid-20s, right? So that's when it's supposed to kind of finally show up. So the span in which this happens, that middle bit that we're looking at, which is the 12 to 17, that's where all of this exciting brain work is happening. And this is also the maximum amount of kids and the amount of time that they're spending. They're both maxed out on these quarters, right? So now this is what's happening at the brain level. It's also changes in gray and white matter. So the brain is losing out or pruning areas that it doesn't need, right? And it's also creating these very effective pathways of communication. It's like shifting from Hebal to being on an Autobahn, right? That's the kind of upgrade that your brain is getting. And why this matters is because there is a basic principle in neurology, which is if you don't use it, you lose it. And that's what's happening to the synaptic connections, right? And it also means that if I am continuously checking my phone, because that is rewarding me, then those are pathways that are being coded for life, right? So we're actually engineering the brain well into adulthood and old age. Yeah? So that is the power of what is happening at the level of brain and biology, which we do not see. We see, like, I'm looking up at my son, he's suddenly grown tall, or my daughter is looking different. Those are visible. But these are the powerful, exciting changes that are happening. And this is the algorithm that the media platforms have got right. They figured that this generates rewards and likes, so that's what we're going to be doing. It rewards motivation. Yeah? So that's the vulnerability.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm going to just come back in a minute to you, Saurabh, to ask about algorithms. But before that, Shekhar, if you wanted to add to that anything about how this individual is located in a social context at this time.
I wanted to build some thoughts around the ideas that have been expressed here. I start with Ms. Nambiar's points on the connection between masculinity and privilege. Michael Kaufman and Michael Kimmel, who have worked extensively on this concept with the argument that the scholarship that has been around feminist experience, feminist ideology, feminist studies and feminist activism is not the same kind of scholarship that characterizes the study of men and masculinities. And Michael Kaufman said in a talk, he was in a group where there were women, and white women and black women, and a white woman said that oppression is an experience that is common to all women, and the black woman put up her hand and said, when you look at the mirror in the morning, what do you see? And the white woman said, I see a woman. And the black woman said, you see, that's the problem. When I look at the mirror, I see a black woman because privilege is invisible to those who have it. And then he went on to say that he was in another meeting where there were a group of men who were talking about reverse gender discrimination with the complaint that jobs were being taken away from deserving men in the name of gender equity. And the title of his thesis was, A Black Woman Took My Job. A black woman took my job. And Michael said, I have a problem with one word in the sentence, a black woman took my job. And the word is my. How did you think that it was your job, and where does the sense of entitlement come from? So their argument is that masculinity is not so much about the theme of absolute power. We understand, Maitri, that patriarchy is alive and kicking. I also don't want to be a prophet of doom, but adolescent mental health is, my friends, is a freaking ticking time bomb. And I'll tell you why. having been on that side of the table for 40 years, I can tell you that things are getting very problematic and complex. So it's not so much about the experience of absolute power, but it's about the experience of entitlement to power, because where men may experience and exercise power over women, the truth is that there are schisms and ruptures between men themselves based on class and caste and so on. So that's the point I wanted to make. The point that I wanted to make in reference to what Saurabh said is that the relationship between adults and children / adolescents, parents and children, teachers, pedagogues, and students, is not based on a culture of conversations. It's based on a culture of control, expectation, and obedience. You cannot wish the media away. You cannot wish the digital world away. The pandemic was only an inflection point where this really came to fore. So we need to be clever to essentially subvert it. And the only way that can happen, to quote what Mesala, played by Stephen Boyd in the Hollywood blockbuster Ben-Hur, said when Judah Ben-Hur was becoming very popular, was to say, how do you fight an idea? You fight an idea with another idea. So we have to garner our strengths and basically create alternate narratives for a nuanced development to take place. With reference to the point that Nina made, this is exceedingly critical, and I'll put it very succinctly. Synaptic pruning occurs front to back, and myelination occurs back to front, which means that part of the brain which is involved in higher order decision making is the last to develop. So maturity is not a birth date that you're 17 years, 364 days old, and you're having your birthday party, and you have your friends together, and at the stroke of midnight, when you're 12, 10, 9, 8, 7, happy birthday, and and next day you become mature. You could actually be 50 years old and getting your 25-year-old daughter married, but to your 80-year-old father, you're still an idiot. That's because in our cultures, we fail to re-establish adult relationships with our children when they grow up. This especially came to fore post-Nirbhaya, and I'll end with that. And there's something else I want to read to you about development. I'll come back to that later. It is said about this 17-year-old that he was the most cruel of the lot. Is that the truth? That is not the truth. It was a trial by media, and it was essentially media depiction. We know this because Saurabh and I have spoken to Justice Madan Lokur, retired judge from the Supreme Court, that he lived 80 kilometers out of Delhi, living in a family with a mentally ill, untreated, dysfunctional parent, truth. That he had a learning disability, he was hit by a teacher, he dropped out of school, shifted to Delhi, sending money home regularly in regular contact with the family, cleaning tables in a roadside eatery, till 4 months before the Nirbhaya episode, truth. That he was befriended by this group of people who ran the transport business and lost contact with the family, and somewhere, for lack of a better term, the perversion of his soul took place, and he was involved in this episode. Now, the Juvenile Justice Act has two components: children in need of care and protection and children in conflict with law. And the question we ask is, where was the Juvenile Justice Act when this adolescent was in need of care and protection? Every child in conflict with law was, and continues to be a child in need of care and protection. Why was the Juvenile Justice Act changed in 2015? Nirbhaya episode. Do we feel strongly about violence against women? Of course we do. But the debate on safety of women is a perverse debate because it's an incomplete debate. The debate must equally be on the freedom of women. You cannot be only talking about safety, important as that is. But a more awful and awesome truth is that the JJ Act was changed because a teacher hit a child. If this teacher had not hit the child, he would have never dropped out of school. He would have not been part of this episode. Will exploitation and violence continue? That's the unfortunate, bitter truth. That's the default mode of human beings. But the act would not have been changed. So we have serious issues to consider here in the context of both the Netflix serial and the context of this panel and an engagement with all of you today who've come with, in such numbers with deep interest and concern about the situation of our young adolescents and the young emerging adults of tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Shekhar. You've gone into the last part of our conversation, so we'll come back to that in a little while. But thank you for pointing out that, you didn't say it, but Jamie was not a monster, right? And that's what you said, Sansita, when you began. These are not bad kids, or these are not monstrous kids. They don't even hate women. It's something that's feeding something that sits in them, which is connected to something that's quite appropriate given their developmental phase. So I want to come back to you, Saurabh, and ask you, what is happening with social media and algorithms? How do they work? And how do they cause havoc when layered upon this vulnerable developmental phase?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think there are two questions really to look at in this context. One, which is the first question, what purpose do these algorithms serve and why are they the bane of our existence, right? And the second question really is how do they affect adolescents, as we've discussed, a particularly vulnerable group of people. The first question, particularly, what do these algorithms do? They aren't as old as these social media platforms, right? Algorithms date back maybe 2009, so maybe about 15, 16 years. Algorithms came into being to basically accentuate user experience on these social media platforms, which is supposed to benefit us. And the other aspect of it was to also boost engagement so that more people use social media platforms for longer periods of time. So that's why algorithms exist. Algorithms, the literal definition of an algorithm is just basically, a sequence that is supposed to address a specific mathematical or a computational problem. That's basically what an algorithm is. For a social media company, that problem is that not enough people are using our platforms for long enough periods of time, and so we need to do something about that. Now, why have algorithms become the real fulcrum of this discussion on sort of radicalization of children is because of the way in which they're designed to work and the fact that there is no oversight and we haven't done anything about it, which is something we'll come to later. They work specifically, like I mentioned, to help make user experience better, which basically means that of all the people in this room, we have different tastes, we have different interests. And so the algorithm, what we call recommendation algorithms or recommendatory systems, will personalize content for you to see that is based on the data it already has of you in terms of what your interests are, what you've spent time looking at, so on and so forth. And so it's supposed to personalize in the hopes that you will find it more interesting and you'll stick with the platform and use it for longer periods of time. That has one problem. The first problem with that is that it creates what we've sort of discussed in terms of echo chambers. It creates filter bubbles. Because if I'm only seeing what I already want to see and what I think is right, I'm never exposed to a diversity of viewpoints. I'm never exposed to anything that's contrary to what I believe. And furthermore, the other part of this problem is engagement related. So personalization, user experience limits our thinking, limits our curiosity. Engagement, on the other hand, is really where the problem, sort of gets set on steroids. Because what these algorithms do to boost engagement is to constantly show you what it thinks you want to see more of. For example, all of us here looking at a train burning may not like looking at a train burning, but if it shows up on our social media screen, chances are we'll spend a little longer looking at it because it's shocking, it invokes a strong emotional response from you, and so therefore gets more engagement. Doesn't mean I want to keep seeing videos of trains burning, doesn't mean any of us want to see that, right? And that applies to people getting lynched, it applies to acts of violence, it applies to misogynistic content, it applies to just about everything. And so if you spend a little longer because one person thinks that, maybe this toxic, this misogynist has something useful to say, versus someone else thinks that, oh my God, I hate what he's saying, but I just want to see what he's saying. Both of them have spent more time engaging with that particular piece of content, and therefore the algorithm is going to show you more of that. And so it's these two things. It's this idea that I must only see content that I want to see, which means I will never grow and presumably eventually become an idiot. And the other part of it is that I will keep seeing content that the algorithm thinks I want to progressively keep seeing. So that's where you get into this sort of issue of algorithmic radicalization. That's actually become a term a lot of sort of scholars are referring to now, because the radicalization isn't actually like the red pill, this idea that, toxic masculinists take from the Matrix, which is that you pop a red pill and your eyes become clear and you see the Matrix for what it is. It isn't actually like that. The radicalization, I'm afraid, works slowly and progressively, which means that I first look at what's something that Sansita picked up on in the beginning of our discussion. I first look at misogynist humor that's presented as dark humor. So I have plausible deniability, because if someone catches me looking at it, I just say, no, I don't believe this. I just, it's just funny as a dark joke. Right? And then the algorithm starts pushing the envelope more and more. And so you start seeing progressively more radicalizing content, progressively more misogynistic content, and eventually the final stop is the worst possible content, right? By the time you as an individual have reached that point, any person will be expected to be radicalized, because the algorithm has fundamentally changed your way of thinking. It has limited the access to information, and it has hardened your own biases and your own sort of limitations. And so what this effectively does then for adolescents is that it takes a problem that affects us all and amplifies it by exacerbating their developmental vulnerabilities, which is the second part of this discussion, right? And what do I mean by that? Something that Dr. Nina had mentioned as well, in terms of adolescents already have a tendency to engage in sensation-seeking behaviors, and therefore greater proclivity to become addicted to using a platform that famously prides itself on engagement, has addictive tendencies inherently in its design. And the other part of this really is just this idea that these platforms, particularly under this rubric of engagement, are creating extremely sort of radical viewpoints. And like I mentioned, it's not happening immediately. But it is happening certainly over a period of time. And there are no guardrails for this, and by the time you reach the worst possible situation, we're likely to see an incident happen. So,
Thank you for that. Sansita, if I can come back to you, we've talked quite a lot about the manosphere and misogynistic content and what's happening to young boys, but how is this impacting girls? Is it similar? Is it different? What have you noticed amongst your peers?
Okay, so I think for young girls, the struggle's a little different. For them, it's a struggle between visibility and vulnerability. So what happens is there's obviously these impossible beauty standards, and young girls go to social media to seek appearance-based validation. And social media is telling them that to be seen, they need to perform. And it's like these kind of reels that I come across, how to be pretty in 2025, or what your nose shape says about you. And what it's doing is it's creating new insecurities for young girls every single day. And while it might seem harmless, it's telling young girls that their value lies in being desirable and being symmetrical. And it's also gotten so relentless and so specific to the point where it's, these terminologies like clean girl aesthetic, or glassy skin, or pouty lips. And, I've noticed that with even me and my peers, we've started to obsess over things that we've never even thought of before. It could be nose shapes, or hip dips, or under-eye colors, or, symmetrical faces. These are not insecurities that we came with. These are insecurities that we learned because the content that we're consuming told us that we had to care about it. And I think for girls and women, for that matter, we just face a lot of backlash just in terms of anything that we do. We're either too bold, or too quiet, or too attention-seeking, or pick me, or not pretty enough. And I just think this hyper-visibility on social media leads to issues in young girls like body image issues, low self-esteem, and anxiety. And at any point, if they feel like disengaging from social media, there's always this concept of FOMO, fear of missing out. And it's often very, very real and very isolating in girls and women. So, yeah, I think what's happened is social media has made femininity a performance. And I just think it's giving young girls the wrong idea about themselves and the world around them.
Thank you for that. So it's quite possibly quite typical for an adolescent to anyway have some insecurities. But here you are, and those insecurities are being amplified, and new layers are being added onto it, and you're being taught how to be kind of obsessive. And you don't want to step out of that because your need to belong, which is again a typical need, keeps you in that loop because you want to be able to talk about the things your friends are talking about, right? Okay, so is there something we can do about this? What do we do? What do we do as parents? What do we do as school communities? What could we do? And I'm going to invite Nina to start us off on this.
With parents or with schools, which one did you want me to?
Whatever feels most compelling to you at this moment.
Yeah. So I think I'm just kind of riffing off on what Shekhar so eloquently put out there. The social construct and this milieu. I think we need to understand that adolescence develops in nested contexts, right? So there is an entire social ecology that we're looking at, and you have the child at the center, and then you have the microsystem, which are the parents and the schools, and then you have the mesosystem, which are the connections and the relationships, and then you have the external, and then you have all of this in a chronosystem. So this is thanks to Bronfenbrenner's work on social ecological models. So when we're looking at how do we address this, I think I want to start with recognizing that if we begin with villainizing this entire construct, we can find ourselves powerless and stuck and not very creative in those avenues. So I think we need to recognize that there are going to be multiple ways then that we have to put our heads together. With schools, and I think maybe I'd like to place that and then move to the families as well. I think schools need to recognize that all learning happens in social and emotional contexts, right? All learning happens in social and emotional contexts. And if as a school you subscribe to that as a philosophy, you subscribe to holding children at the center of whatever you do. And if you do that, you can't go wrong, right? So if schools were involved in creating safe places of connection and belonging, you create a better, secure sense of self for children, and you create what we call protective factors, right? Now, all of this is out there, but what is it that determines that one person goes Jamie's way and the other person turns out to be his sister, right? So what are protective factors? And creating spaces of belonging, connection are what is in our power to do and what we have to intentionally do. I also believe that there is such a thing as being very, very overt about the kind of instruction that happens with digital safety, right? We're not just leaving it to the thing of saying, go out there and make great decisions. I hope you know what cyberbullying looks like. And just throw in a whole bit of terminology, but actually to break it down for kids and to say, if somebody did this and this and this is what it actually looks like, and this is what you need to call out, right? So the kind of instruction and creating that sense of resilience and digital citizenship is, I feel, something that schools and parents have to absolutely engage with at all times, yeah? And I think with parents, this is a hard age. And I think anybody who's worked with or been a parent of an adolescent knows that, knows the heartache that's involved with bringing up an adolescent. It's also the sense that you have to question your assumptions of control, as Shekhar pointed out, right? And I think what scared a lot of parents in my conversations with them was the recognition that they're not in control. When they went through this sudden understanding that I don't know what my kid is up to or what's going to happen, sent this like cold fear down your spine, right? So examining your ideas of control with adolescence means that you have to look at ways in which you parent. And I'm going back to Shekhar's thing of what are those relationships looking like dynamically? Are you creating those conversations at home then? Are you curious about what your child is doing? Are you also creating caring, safe spaces within the home? And I believe that building those protective factors are what then reduce the risks of what's out there.
Thank you, Nina. Shekhar, would you like to?
I just wanted to expand on the point that Nina made. Professor Krishna Kumar, who was the chairperson of NCERT, he's written a little sweet little book called On What is Worth Teaching. In that there is a chapter called On Growing Up Male. And he makes a point there, friends, precisely the point that Nina made, that schools must act as counter-socializers. So if civil society paints men and women and relationships in a certain way, the culture of questioning and the culture of counter-socialization must really occur in schools. The other point I wanted to make was when this serial actually came out, and there's a particular episode where there is a conversation between the psychologist and Jamie. The nature of that conversation may seem confrontational. There are, techniques of constructive confrontations and conversation, but constructivist conversations, both in families and in the school situations, on subjects and topics which are hitherto not spoken about. The body and attraction and sexuality and gender and so on. These are not commonly spoken about. Why in families and schools, Nina? They're not spoken about even in medical colleges. I certainly recall during internship, during a 15-day posting in what was called as family planning, with due apologies to any Bengali present here, my teacher's name was Dr. Nirod Banerjee, whose parents had obviously named him before Hindustan Latex started manufacturing condoms. But he made us realize the problems in a dignified and a useful language to speak about issues that we really don't speak about. The next thing I wanted to say was Saurabh and our technical lead in Samvad, Dr. Sheila Ramaswamy, and I wrote a paper on this serial which was published in the Asian Journal of Psychiatry. I'm not going to quote from that paper, but interestingly, an Indian psychiatrist in UK wrote a comment on that. I'm just going to share 10 lines from that. And he said that he was quoting actually Van Genep's framework on what he calls as liminal stages. It's an anthropological concept which helps us understand rites of passage. And he says that there are 3 stages: separation, which is leaving childhood; liminality, which is the transitional phase; and reintegration, which is entering adulthood. And what my friend Dr. Rajendran says is, this is not Rajendra, by the way, is developing the idea that the modern adolescents become trapped in what we call as digital liminality. They've separated from childhood protections, but cannot successfully reintegrate into healthy adult communities. Instead, online spaces, remember what Saurabh pointed out, exploit this vulnerable transitional state by offering toxic substitutes for traditional coming-of-age guidance. Where traditional societies provided structural pathways and mentorship during liminal phases, today's adolescents navigate this crucial period largely alone in digital environments designed for engagement rather than development. The manosphere essentially hijacks the liminal process, offering false resolution to developmental challenges through ideological frameworks that promise identity, belonging, and purpose, but deliver isolation, resentment, and sometimes violence. The suggestion, Maitri, therefore, is that effective interventions need to address not just individual pathology, but the absence of healthy liminal structures in our digital age. And we might need to create new forms of mentorship and community that can compete with the toxic certainty that are offered by extremist online spaces.
Wow, thank you for that. And that's a really hard ask, because you're saying it has to compete with something that is so incredibly compelling to the brain and so easy. But that's the task that needs to be done.
It's got to be done.
Yep. What can we do, Sansita?
I think Dr. Neena and Dr. Shekhar just brilliantly explained what I was going to put it in brief. But again, just creating open spaces so that our young boys and girls don't look for answers in the wrong places and get substitutes, like what Sir mentioned, to form their worldview and their ideas of, again, gender and identity and sex. So I just feel like, when adults around adolescents are afraid of having these hard conversations, we can't expect them to navigate the world on their own. And I think schools would benefit from adding digital literacy, media literacy, and emotional education to their core curricula. Because adolescents, of course, spend a lot of time in school and they interact with their peers, and it would help that awareness is instilled in them. Because, so I have a 15-year-old brother, and I had a conversation with him after I watched the show. And so to his credit, immediately he expressed disagreement with, these kind of ideologies. But it struck me that he wasn't fully aware of what was happening to him. He wasn't fully aware of why I was bringing it up or having the conversation or the severity of it all, So I do think schools would benefit from that kind of education and awareness. And also, just as young people, I think we should critically participate in our digital environments and not just act as passive scrollers. I think we should question what we see, question what we watch, and we shouldn't let virality replace our values.
Thank you for that. And I'm really taken by what you said about something that you can see at 19 is something that he has trouble, while he says it, he has trouble seeing the whole gravity of it. And how valuable it is that there's someone who's 19 who's able to point out to someone who's 15 that, hey, this is messed up, right? And I think that's the weird isolation that's also happening, where kids are not actually able to support one another very effectively and could do very well with hearing a 19-year-old, which he'll never take from a 42-year-old, right? What do you think we can do?
This might just be the unfortunate downside of being a lawyer, but I genuinely think that this is a place that needs regulation. And what shocks me is the fact that we don't have any. If I told everyone in this room to go buy, a Tetra Pak or something, or buy a food product that has absolutely no sort of safety standards, nobody would buy it. Any other consumer good, right, that we think about, that we consume, we expect that there is some safety standard. And if the company were to make the argument that this hurts our bottom line, well, everyone in this room will say, well, good luck, I don't care. You still need to ensure that this doesn't cause demonstrable harm. But somehow we don't have that conversation with social media platforms. And I think that's the issue with that is how we conceptualize these platforms. You know, Elon Musk famously, before buying Twitter and then turning into X, called Twitter the public town hall. But that's not actually an accurate description of what it is. Because in a public town hall, you can speak to people, you can hear a variety of views, and nobody's voice gets more traction than the other. And that's simply not the way we know social media platforms work, because algorithms incentivize and disincentivize certain voices. I think, I'm forgetting where I read this, but someone described social media platforms perfectly. Everyone has the right to speak, but not everyone has the right to be heard. Which is ironic because the right to participation under the Convention on the Rights of the Child defines child participation as the right to be heard. We don't have this because the algorithms push certain kinds of content, right? And coming back to my point about, we didn't speak about algorithms so much, what a lot of scholars are doing now is to make the point that we need to stop looking at social media platforms as approximations of social experiences, which is what we thought they were initially. When a lot of you first joined social media platforms, you probably joined it because you were able to reconnect with a school friend or you were able to meet different people. It actually served a social purpose. You don't have to tell someone you love them, you just press the heart react on a post, and that's the way you communicate some kind of affection. It's an approximation of a social experience. And I just want to quote Facebook itself, right? Zuckerberg, during the Federal Trade Commission inquiry proceedings, because Facebook is being accused of being a monopoly, which it is, said, don't call us social media platforms. Social media platforms are an outdated concept that belonged to the 2010s. He himself, the head of a social media company, says that we are better understood as digital consumption companies or as broadcast platforms. Right? Because you're being sold different things. Your data is being used to give you personalized suggestions so that the company can sell something to you. This is not a public town hall. This is not a new social experience. This is just a service, right? And what a lot of people have been making the case for is to look at recommendation algorithms as a service. If they're selling you a service, if the algorithm is a service, then we can regulate it and we should, right? Our response then should be to not sort of look at these recommendation algorithms and say that, this is what the company does and I guess we're okay with it, but it should be to characterize this as a service and then to regulate it accordingly, which is possible. There's been a lot of research, a lot of countries have sort of experimented with this idea of an algorithm audit, right? You don't need Coca-Cola's secret recipe to know how they make Coke to be able to, sort of gauge whether it's healthy or not healthy. And that's really the point. Algorithms can still be black boxes if they're proprietary for whatever reason, but we can still make the case that there are demonstrable harms. The reason you don't sell cigarettes to people under the age of 18, there are demonstrable harms, irrespective of the fact that Big Tobacco made the case that cigarettes were healthy, right? Now, how do we do this? You audit algorithms. You don't need to know what the secret ingredients or spices is that makes these algorithms, but you can still audit to say that these are the risks and these are the utilities, what is called a risk-utility assessment of these platforms, right? And this is the potential for risk. It's an interesting point, but a meta sort of analysis of different review studies actually found that the potential risk for harm for food safety products and algorithms is quite similar. It's about 10 to 15%. But food products have food standards, right? You have an authority that says that this potentially is going to be harmful, limit this. Going back to Sansita's point, right, about these impossible beauty standards, we know why this exists. In 2021, there was a Facebook whistleblower who shared internal studies that documented that 1 in 5 girls were likely to face severe dysmorphia and potentially even suicidal thoughts because of what they were seeing, these unattainable beauty standards online. But the companies didn't care because they were boosting engagement. And so a few people died, it didn't matter to them. But it has to matter to us. And so I think what we need to do is to really make a case for regulation. There are many examples. Australia did a horrible job of trying to ban social media because every kid with a computer can presumably use a VPN and get around it. But one thing they did do right was institute a separate authority, what they call e-safety commissioners. The e-safety commissioner speaks to industry leaders, speaks to tech companies, speaks to parents, has consultations like this, right? And they address what the immediate harms are and what companies should do to mitigate those harms. If companies face this sort of accountability, if there was transparency about the harm that was stemming from their service, we'd be able to regulate it. But the point is right now it's the Wild West. There's no regulation. of these algorithms, and so companies can basically do whatever they want by lying to us, by telling us that they're giving us a social world to plug into, when all they're just selling us is a bad product. Right? So.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate that you sort of put this out there as a public health concern, right? And like all public health concerns, it's not going to, the market forces are not going to take care of it, right? So there has to be regulation, and thank you for that. And thank you for each of you for having put down, from your perspective also, what is, how does one actually institute or operationalize the right to be heard, which I didn't realize was a right. And it's not the right, it's not to be taught information, but it's the space where you are heard. And that really turns on its head what we think social emotional learning is. Because right now we think it's about giving kids a bunch of information. But if we think about it as creating spaces where you have the right and where you are heard, then perhaps we have some possibility here to begin to kind of navigate this rather difficult risk that we're all facing together. So, because I figured this is a large audience and there are likely to be many, many questions, we've stopped a little bit, bang on time, and we are happy to open it up to questions. So,
good evening. My name is Anya, and I'm a play therapist. And something I've noticed with the preteen girls that I'm working with is their use of makeup. And I mean full-grade adult makeup. And I work with parents as well who struggle with, getting their kids to not cave, while there are parents who buy their children full adult-grade makeup. So when I also do online sessions with these children, they're dying to do them on Zoom because it has effects like I can wear makeup, I get to, dress up the way I want, I get to present myself the way I want physically. And especially for preteen girls where their body's changing, hormones changing, everything, it's a big deal. So this is something that I am slowly working with these children on, but I would deeply appreciate any professional insights, especially from Nina, since I know she works at Aditi.
Nina, birthday parties at Sephora?
Yeah. Right. Thank you. Great question. And I think it's probably opening up a whole bunch of other questions as well, where you're coming into places where you recognize that your adolescent is going to want to define a sense of self. They're establishing identities. They're going to push your buttons. That's what you kind of signed up for as a parent. You have to kind of work around that. It's also about being able to recognize that as a parent, you have to have some clear boundaries that you want to look at. So I'm quoting Diana Bomrin's work, which looks at parenting styles and which ones are the most effective. And what we're reporting is that parents who demonstrate authoritative parenting styles, which is different from authoritarian, where we do not want to go Trump side. But with authoritative parenting, we have parents who have very clear boundaries. They are also unconditional in their love and regard and support for their children. And I think children are okay with hearing no at times. The number of times that parents sometimes would come in and say, but he's not listening to me, she's not listening to me. You are the parent, you are the adult in the room, and there may be some decisions that you need to make. So I think as hard as it is sometimes for a parent to have to deal with somebody who's upset with you, who says, I hate you, you're the wicked mother, everybody else's mother is cool, or father is like the coolest, right? You just have to work with that and say, in this house, these are going to be some of the rules that we work with, and ride it out. Most times it's the distress that we experience as parents. It feels like a little hard to have to ride that bit out. And so we end up giving in and saying, she's going to feel bad if I don't let her do this with her friends and so on and so on. And that's okay, they survive. You can say no. Say no.
Thank you.
Hello. I had a question, a specific question regarding whether it is advisable to curtail digital exposure. Like, I have a 15-year-old. So, of course, what Dr. Nina said, that you're the uncoolest mother, nobody takes the phone away. So we tried to monitor her internet activities, and then she found a way to sort of, we don't know, she's like 0 hours online. That's what we were seeing in the report, So what now, right? I'm like, I would really love to set a limit like that. At 8 o'clock, your phone needs to come to me, or 9 o'clock, your phone needs to come to me, something. So the phone comes to me in the night, and I'm asleep because I'm exhausted. So 10 o'clock, I'm like gone. And during the night, sometimes she'll come and she'll just plug the phone in. So if you suggest that it is, I can do that, or it is desirable, or something that can be explored, then I will sit over there in her room and say, I need your phone. And that's okay, finish off whatever you're doing. Is that something that is that should be done?
Maybe I'm going to ask Sansita to take this question, because I think...
Okay, so I'd like to say that my father's in the audience, and he was exactly in the same place you were in, and every night he did take my phone away. And I did find my way to sneak back in and get it back. But now that I'm a little more grown up, I'd like to say that I'm extremely grateful for that. And I think I was just 13 or 12 or 14, and at that age, I'm so glad that I wasn't allowed to make social media accounts and interact that much on digital environments. And it protected me from a lot of content that I would have been exposed to, which would have, affected me very drastically. And at that point, these are impressionable, malleable young minds. And I think it's important as a parent to maintain that level of authority, the right level of authority. Because I don't think the answer is in any of the extremes. I don't think it's, let's take away the phone entirely, or let's just ban social media, because that would just lead to resentment from your young boys and girls. So I think from my experience, it just benefited me a lot. So I don't think you have anything to worry about.
When the pandemic hit and education went online, the issue that you're raising found its way into various professional bodies, pediatric associations and so on, because of the amount of time that kids had to spend online. In a scenario where the digital world already existed, even before the pandemic, digital education existed, and people were already on social platforms and so on. And based on the developmental levels of the child, recommendations were given for preschoolers, how much of screen time should be allowed, and should it be continuous, or should it be in bits and parts, and as they grew into middle school and early adolescence and late adolescence, given the educational requirements and their need for socialization and being connected to their friends and their social networks, the amount of time increases. That's one part of the reality. But the important issue, again, to come back to what I started with, is there is a difference between processed experience and unprocessed experience. If you sit a 3-year-old down in front of a television because you have stuff to deal with, it's convenient. But for a 3-year-old, that's merely an image. It does not that experience doesn't necessarily convert into knowledge or information, unless you sit with the child and say, oh, look, they are eating. Oops, he dropped a glass. And then the image is converted into knowledge. And this is why we say that there are a whole lot of images that exist out there, whether it's OTT platforms or social media, notwithstanding, Twitter and so on, and Trump and Musk being Trump's ex now. But particularly where relationships and sexuality and gender is concerned, to allow for questions that are hitherto uncomfortable. And if these conversations are avoided or relegated, as they have indeed even been in mainstream medicine, problems related to sexuality have always been relegated to the back alleys and bylanes of quacks. You know, gas piles, constipation, anal fissures, impotence come to so and so, but not in mainstream medicine. So this is problematic because, to come back to what I said, if there is a culture of conversations, you don't avoid stuff. And then you build healthy conversations, and no subject is taboo. And you give the opportunity, therefore, for nuanced knowledge and healthy behavioral choices thereof to take place. So that's the kind of approach that one would really, advocate.
Hi, I'm Abhijit. My son is 13, so I have not yet hit the deep end. But a couple of questions I had. One was, of course, one of the rights that we still hold on to is the right to not to engage, right? So why don't we not engage in these social media platforms? That is one thing. I think this entire evening we've been taking social media for granted. So none of us are, saying that why do we need to engage in the first place? That is one point. The second point that I've noticed myself doing when it comes to my son is that I tell him, oh, you've been watching YouTube for a long time, why don't you go out and play? And then I go back to doom scrolling on my phone, right? That's not done. That's not done, right? I need to set an example. I need to engage. I need to show what else is there to do, One of the standard things that they talk in management is that don't come to me with a problem and point out to a problem to me. Show me a solution. So for me, one of the things that I've seen help, at least from my understanding of what my son is going through at his age, is to have him engage by me being present there in something external, in something maybe physical, maybe cycling, maybe just taking a walk, maybe reading a book, maybe whatever it is. But rather than just being, what Nina said, authoritarian, maybe more a peer, I don't know, but maybe more being a true parent. I don't really know how to say this. So yeah, these are the 2 points that struck me during the entire discussion.
Thank you for that. We'll take another question.
Hello. Hi. So I work at an outdoor education organization. We take schools and kids trekking out in the nature. And one of the rules we implement for safety is no phones allowed on the trek, which tends to create a lot of anxiety and panic among the parents of the students who are sending them on the trek, because they want the kids to have the phone in their hand so that they can get the update every hour, every meal, every minute. And this is something, obviously now we try to put down because of safety reasons. This is not allowed and you'll get it back once you're back at the base camp. But I've noticed a growing anxiety among parents itself that is pushing the phone on the kids so that they can track them. And I wanted to get your insight on, 1 or 2 parents in a group sometimes are the type who have a no phones rule and, they encourage it. But by and large, we are noticing this more and more. And it makes our job difficult as well, because the crux of our job is to take them out in nature, do a digital detox. And we do see those transformations at the end of these treks. But this new style of, parenting, or I don't know what it is, helicopter, what to call it now, but it's making our job difficult as well while we try to solve this problem. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you so much for that. And I think if we connect that up with what the gentleman just before this said, is sort of reflecting on what we're doing as parents, right? And the effort that it takes to create real-world connection, real-world activity. It takes a bit more effort. It doesn't happen so easily, and the reward to the brain is more staggered. right? And therefore it doesn't have that immediate high feeling. And long term, though, it's better for us. So it takes effort on the brain, the individual's brain. It takes effort from the parent and time. And we've got a lot going on. So I'm not going to, pretend like it's easy to come by this time and effort. And this phone has as much addictive properties towards me, although the risks are lower because my prefrontal cortex was developed at a time when this thing wasn't around. But I think it's an important point to think about. One is that the effort. Two, what you brought up is the anxiety, parental anxiety, and a desire to be connected to our children in that particular way all the time. So again, it's not a type of connection that you were talking about, Shekhar, right? It's actually surveillance. And somehow we feel if we know where they are. I mean, I know of, I'm not going into it, but parents do crazy things. When their children go on school trips, they're like tagging them. I mean, the sense that somehow if I know where I can track them where they are, that somehow that it makes them safer. So there's something about parents being able to let go in some ways and be more vigilant in others. So thank you for both of those points.
Hello, good evening. It's quite a very enlightening session, and I just want to make one point, and my observation is addressed to the entire panel and more to Dr. Saurabh, since he was the one who raised the convention and the participation rights of children. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
The way I see it is, a gentleman just now was mentioning why not we desist social media. But the way I feel is the 21st century children are like the proverbial fish and water. So digital media is the water and they are the fish. So there is no way we can eliminate the influence of it. And coming to the part of the participatory rights, here I see a lot of enlightened and mostly people who are younger to me, but still they are wise and aged and more in wisdom, and we are enlightening them. But what about the process from way forward? Then how? I mean, shouldn't we include the, younger crowd into seminars of this sort so that they are the ones who need to be enlightened? I mean, we really don't know what's happening in the adolescent's mind. And really, I would request the panel's members, what do you think is the way forward to draw the adolescents into this awareness part?
Thank you so much for the question. I'm unfortunately not a doctor, just a mere lawyer. But I'll take a couple of those questions together. This idea of the right to not sort of engage, which I think is an important question. But if we think of any technological development for the past, at least say 20 years, if that's a reasonable enough timeline, if any sort of technology or any sort of advancement reaches a critical mass of acceptance and usage, it's impossible to really not engage, right? Because you're not just asking your kid to not engage with this fanciful item that maybe 3 people in their school have. You're asking this child to not engage with something that has become a defining characteristic of everyone's lives around them, which feels like an impossible task to expect an adolescent to do, let alone an actual adult, right? But there are ways to go about this, and to come back to the point you made, ma'am, about this idea that adolescents are smart today. This is not a particularly, I don't think this is a really an opinion that will sort of get me a lot of acceptance, but I don't think that's true. I don't think adolescents have gotten smarter today, right? With due apologies to the adolescents, being tech savvy, having information that's accessible at your phone in very specific ways, right? And having your social worlds shaped by a certain kind of contingent information ecosystem does not make one smarter. This is not to say that people have gotten dumber necessarily. I also reject that argument. But I don't think there's been any great leap forward, right? What has actually happened? What has happened is that there is a lot more information available right now, but there is a lot less critical sort of thinking. Critical thinking has died many deaths because of social media over the past few years, because there is a willingness to confirm and accept what I already know, which means that it's harder, what Sansita was talking about in her discussions with her brother, it's harder to question something that feels self-evident. and it feels like automatically it's true. I would say that losing the faculty of critical thinking is perhaps something we should be concerned about. I don't think it points to adolescents being necessarily smarter. And I don't think that's anyone's specific fault. If any of us were to grow up in similar conditions, we'd also be very similarly situated. But the way to go about it, and then, to sort of answer the question, I don't think it's to say don't use social media, but just teach adolescents to be critical about it. If you see something online, it's not just cool to sort of accept it and go along with this group thinking if your entire group is polarized, but it's probably cooler to actually question it and have a hot take, right? Have this take that nobody else has, that you think is based on facts, that you think is informed, that you think is argumentative, you think is sort of convincing, right? And to generate that sort of critical thinking. My whole life, my father sort of, we've gotten back and forth over every possible discussion you can think about, right? And my entire sort of love for debating during my college years came from that willingness to constantly argue about every single thing, right? And I value that today because it sort of taught me in a very visceral sense what critical thinking can do for you. I think that's important so that when adolescents see, this impossible, enhanced sort of beauty standard, they're able to critically look at it and be like, that's nonsense. Or when you see misogynistic content, they're able to, some women can't drive cars, and then the person looks at it and says, but most accidents are caused by annoying men. You have the possibility to respond to it, and if they can respond to it, then the information ecosystem doesn't end up oppressing them, which I think is the issue.
Am I audible? Yeah.
Yes.
So thanks so much for the conversation, extremely rich perspectives. So one question I have is, this whole idea of adolescent misogyny, I want to know how much of that can be traced to the poor conditioning that adolescents of today have with regards to working with their own sexual attraction with, the other gender, and are there other factors, if at all, and how much would you attribute to this particular factor? The reason I'm also asking is the aspect of manosphere that I understood was about this adolescent who's a sexual loser, in this so-called scarcity competitive sexual, space. So that's one. And the related question is, where does pornography play a part in all of this, if at all it has a part to play? That's all.
Thank you. Do we want to take 2 more questions and then...
Hi, thank you for that very, very engaging conversation. My question, thank you, Saurav, for bringing up very necessary detail about the legal guardrails that is required and the regulatory bodies that might be required. But how far are we from it? How can we really hold these extremely powerful companies accountable? Like you said, in Australia, in France, in Finland, we've had some, whether they've failed or succeeded, but some counter voices and even legal guardrails against also parents who are putting up, sensitive content against children, about their children, sharenting, all of that we are talking about. But how far are we really from, holding those who are actually accountable?
One more question.
Hello, hi. My name is Meher. I'm a public health researcher. Thank you for the lovely panel, very illuminating. My question is, as Indians, our culture, we're highly inequitable country, inequitable population. So my question stems from when we have this adolescent population, what we call this demographic dividend, highest youth population, is when we bring in interventions, is interventions better at a young adult phase? Because I personally, from my limited experience, see adolescence as a largely or a relatively, relatively helpless demographic, where they don't have where they aren't able to take calls, whether it is when it comes to, say, seeking mental health care or seeking psychiatric care or seeking any kind of information, especially when we're looking at an inequitable space. So do we bring in interventions at the young adult level? Would that be a better space to bring in interventions where, levels of agency goes up? Yeah, I'll pause there.
So 3 different questions. Who would like to speak to which question? There's one on sexuality and sexual development and pornography. There's one on how far are we from actually moving forward towards regulations. Is it realistic? And then there's this question about whether public health intervention should be targeted at young adults so that because they have more agency to make their own choices. So.
Just a word on pornography. It's one of the world's biggest money-making industries, as we all know. And there was an argument put forth actually by some feminist group who said that we have no problems with pornography if there was an equal amount devoted for the pleasure of women. With beefcake and so on. The problem again to frame this idea between toxic content, problematic content, pornography, is that it cannot be wished away. It can be accessed. And we are not just talking about hardcore porn. We are also talking about the softest stuff. Which is rampant in OTT platforms. There are many serials that on the OTT platform that speak about relationships and sexualities in fairly explicit ways. The only way, therefore, to address this is by conversations that are counter-socializing. It is not by avoidance, it is not by surveillance, not by vigilance. It has to be with conversations. I just give you a small example. I'm a little conscious of time. I'll try to make this fast. I was doing this.
We've been told we can go 10 minutes over.
Right. I was doing this session in a school. This was during the HIV/AIDS pandemic. 14-year-olds, and I was supposed to speak on the whole context of HIV/AIDS, followed by Q&A. And when I entered the room, I saw this 14-year-old with bright eyes sitting in his chair with a lot of energy, and I knew he would be trouble. So I finished my talk, and then I started any questions, and I was avoiding eye contact with him. He was, and then he said, "Doctor, is it all right to have sex with a woman when she's menstruating?" Now, I was young in my career then. So I thought to myself, if he had put this question to his father or his uncle, एक झापड़ मिलता उसको. ये मोबाइल फोन का ज़माना नहीं था. I said, look, forget about the sex and the menstruation. Who is the woman? Relative, neighbor, problem, no? Same guy. If that is not the problem, then is it okay? I said, look, why are we doing this session? We're talking about safe relationships, about multiple partners, unsafe sex, and so on. There's a health context to which why we are doing this session. If that is not the problem, then is it okay? I said, look, let's speak about conception and contraception, safe period. By and large, a day or two before, a day or two after, and the time of periods is considered to be relatively safe. But we don't know. People make mistakes in calculation. So if that is not the problem, then is it okay? I said, look, the opportunities available to men and boys to explore relationship and those available to girls and women are different. Your sexuality ideology, is it in the context of a socially legitimate or sanctioned relationship in a heterosexual context. And mind you, we are not just talking about a heterosexual context here. We must realize that there are 10 to 20% of young kids out there who are not heterosexual, and they have lives and predicament as well, which we need to recognize. If that is not the problem, then is it okay? I said, look, I don't know. Some people think it is kinky and exciting, and some people think it is yucky and distasteful. These are personal and private choices that we make in your life. But see what I've done, friends, what I did. I gave a frame of reference by allowing the discussion to proceed in ways that then gave a sense of stability in safe, healthy, responsible, and happy choices. So that's really the key to addressing this, and that really brings me to the whole public health issue. Saurav and I have recently completed a 5-year memorandum that we had to run India's largest public child mental health initiative, where we worked with precisely these kind of issues in the education sector, in the mental health sector, in the care and protection sector, and also in policy and law of children who are victims and children who are victim witnesses. Because that's the reality of the lives that our adolescents experience and endure. Some of the material of this public child mental health work is available in public domain. I would be happy to share it through the BIC network, Ashish, if that makes sense. We are also available to share some of this. And we hope that we will continue this work essentially to provide answers to the kind of questions that I'm here. This is precisely what we do, friends, in public child mental health work.
Thank you so much for that. And to the question of regulation.
I don't have a good answer to that. I think we're not close because we haven't diagnosed the problem yet. There is no sort of discussion around the fact that we're being sold these social products that are bad and defective and need to be sort of regulated so that they perform, they're better, they function better. And I don't think that conversation is happening in terms of who's really responsible for this, because every time we see untoward incidents happen, where there's self-inflicted harm or there's violence against other people, the conversation is always about insufficient parenting, right? And that becomes the way the sort of media also typically reports a lot of this. And I keep going back to what Professor Amartya Sen described in his sort of thesis on the capability theory, right? Which is the idea that if we expect the outcome or the achievement to be someone who is not antisocial but social, well-adjusted, sort of able to live in a democratic society reasonably well, then there must be the capabilities, the opportunities provided for someone to develop into that person. If the capabilities and the opportunities are not, or are the opportunities not provided to develop those capabilities because you're constantly bombarded by extremely polarizing and sort of radicalizing content, then you can never reasonably be expected to achieve that state. And so I think if we approach it from that context, right, and constantly discuss every single issue we see reported in the media as a public health crisis, with adolescents bearing, with responsibility to be borne by these companies, I think we stand a chance to at least begin a campaign of that sort to exert pressure, because regulation doesn't come without public pressure. It has to come from public campaigns. So.
Thank you. And since we have a few more minutes, we can take a few more questions.
This is slightly technical. Algorithms are created by people, and people can be regulated. But we are getting into an era where artificial intelligence is going to write the algorithms for us. So there will be nobody to catch. It's going to be a very difficult thing, but your suggestion that regulation, it's very, very important. But it is going to be very, very difficult. And a lot of work has to be sponsored. In fact, a lot of research has to be done in order to overcome this. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment.
Hi, I'm surprised nobody asks questions on gaming, right? I mean, I know it's about social media. So I have a 10-year-old, and every day after he comes from school, there is this negotiation of how much game time we should give. So we've settled on like half an hour. And my wife is now okay because we settled on that because I was the one who introduced him to games. But I'm trying to negotiate, like at one point being like a cool dad, but also trying to see, like not deprive him of, kind of excitement, right? Because he's not getting a phone for quite some time. So any thoughts on gaming as such, he doesn't play violent games, and also recently, very funny incident, he found out he has friends in the apartment complex which he plays games with Roblox, and he called one of his friends fatty, and he was banned. And then I reinstated his account. So he was very happy, but he's also kind of figuring out some of these things, in terms of interaction with games. So some part of me thinks it's healthy, but I would love some thoughts on that.
Thank you for just being so honest in sharing what's happening at home. I think what this is kind of getting me to reflect on is, for most of us as parents out there, when do we send out an SOS signal? When do we figure that my kids' media use right now is worrisome and problematic, and therefore I need to do something, right? And I think that's kind of leading to that. But to answer your question, I think if your child has a range of activities in addition to what he's doing with his Roblox, we're good, all right? If that is the only thing that he's doing in the evening and he's not in active play, face-to-face contact and rolling around and getting hurt and navigating some very difficult social situations, who walked off with a bat, things like that, then we need to kind of reassess what's going on there. So with parents, to know that we are in times where you do have your child who is going to be in these social circles where what they've played is what comes up in discussion on the playground in school, in the break and in lunch and so on. And you can't just have your child sit by the corner, right? So you want to be able to regulate and moderate some of this. Just make sure that there is enough of active physical play, right? To respond to the other parts, which is when does it get problematic? And I think there was a JAMA study that's out just 2 weeks ago, which talks about that it's not just the time that we're spending on our devices, but the addictive nature. And if we have problems with turning screens off, if it is impairing the quality of our life in specific ways, if that is the only thing that we're constantly thinking of, and we're unable to regulate our lives in other ways, then we do know that it has taken on an addictive flavor, and then it is problematic, and parents do need to actually step in. But providing adequate, healthy choices, and I'm going back to what we've come up as a panel, is useful. I also don't think we have to get into places where we have to enlighten younger kids. They're beyond wise. We have to respect that they come with a sense of agency, and to work with that. Because with adolescence, and you're going to find that their ability to reason out with you, and sort of all the arguments that you had, has made you the fantastic orator that you are, right? But if you had a parent who said, I need for you to be respectful, and you cannot argue with me, and we cannot have these conversations, your home does not become a place where you're heard. Yeah? So I don't know if that answers some of the Roblox, but yes, half an hour is good.
And one
as long as it stays half an hour.
Oh, we'll have to stop. Okay, I'm so sorry but we're out of time. I just want to do a last, because Sansita, if there was something that you'd like this audience to go away with, what would it be?
Yeah, I think I'd just like to say that, the fact that the show resonated so deeply with Indians shows that we're all sensing the same thing, We're sensing that there's something severely broken in the way we're letting the internet raise our children. and that adolescents today are being shaped by these algorithmically curated ideologies. And this is not just a fringe issue anymore. It's not just happening in the West, you know. It's happening right here. It's happening right in front of us. It's happening in our classrooms. It's happening in our group chats. It's happening even at the dining table. And I think it shows that we're finally ready to listen and we're finally ready to have conversations like this.
And on that note, thank you to Nina, to Shekhar, to Sansita, to Saurabh, and thank you to the BIC team for helping us organize this panel.